All right, buckle up, because today's deep dive, we're going deep into the mind of Descartes, specifically his modal metaphysics. We're talking possibility and necessity, as seen through, well, excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Descartes' modal metaphysics.
It's going to be interesting because, Descartes, he sets a high bar for what counts as possible. He's not just talking about, anything we can vaguely imagine.
So let's break it down then. What is it about Descartes' view of possibility that makes it so unique? The Stanford Encyclopedia, it mentions this idea of clear and distinct perception.
Exactly. For Descartes, a modal claim, a statement about what's possible or necessary, it's only worthwhile if it's based on that clear and distinct perception. Think of it almost like he's filtering out all the noise, the guesswork, that usually surrounds how we think about possibility.
Okay, so let me try this out. So I'm looking at this Blee mug,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm thinking, could it have been red? Would Descartes say, hold on a sec, is that perception of redness clear and distinct enough to even be a real possibility?
He would. He'd probably argue that our senses, they're not reliable enough to really get at these metaphysical truths. He wants to go deeper, you see, beyond just our sensory experience, to find those foundational principles that govern what's possible.
I can already tell this is so different from how we usually talk about what could be. It's a lot more, I don't know, rigorous, almost like he's using like mathematical certainty, but applying it to possibility.
You're right on the money with that. That's really key to understanding what Descartes is doing overall, trying to ground philosophy, on something as solid as geometry.
Yeah, I see that. Makes sense. So where does this whole clear and distinct perception filter, where does that come in?
Yeah.
When we look at some of Descartes' famous thought experiments, like in the Meditations, he throws out these wild possibilities, evil demon deceiving us, the world being totally different than we see it.
Right, yeah, those are classic examples. But remember, with the meditations, it's a specific kind of method he's using. It's analytical, almost like a controlled demolition. He's introducing these radical doubts, what he calls fictions sometimes, to clear the ground for a more certain foundation.
So he's not actually saying, hey, what if there's an evil demon messing with your mind? He's using it to take us somewhere.
Exactly. It's not about believing those possibilities are true. It's more like a philosophical stress test. He's pushing our doubts as far as they can go so we can see what we can really know for sure.
I like that, like a mental workout. You strain your mind, considering the crazy stuff, but you build up your ability to see what's really real, what's reliable.
That's a fantastic way to put it. Once we get that analytical method, we can see those fictions, not as like endorsements. They're tools for philosophical work.
Makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got clear and distinct perception as the basis. And we know Descartes uses radical doubt, but kind of strategically. But what happens when we use these ideas on some of his, well, more mind-bending stuff, like the eternal truths problem?
Ah, yes. Now we're getting into one of the trickiest parts of Descartes' modal metaphysics. He says God created eternal truth, the laws of math and logic. But he also says they're necessary. They couldn't be any other way.
Right, and that's where I get stuck. How can something be created and necessary at the same time?
Yeah.
If God created them, doesn't that mean he could have made them differently?
It's a total head-scratcher. It's generated so much debate, even among, serious Descartes scholars. One approach is to look at, well, what does he even mean by necessary? Are there different ways to interpret that?
Okay, let's do that. What are some of the, the leading interpretations out there?
Well, one option is that the eternal truths are contingent. They could have been different. But as you said, that kind of clashes with this perfect God idea. Hard to picture a perfect God creating a world where 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah, that doesn't seem to fit with the rest of his thinking. So what's another option then?
Another one is maybe eternal truths are possibly necessary, meaning God could have made them different, but there's some higher necessity, even above God. But that runs into problems too, right? Limits God's power in a way Descartes probably wouldn't like.
Okay, so both those interpretations seem to hit a wall. Is there any way to say those eternal truths are created but also necessary without limiting God or saying they could have been different?
Well, there is another way some people try to make it all fit together. They say the eternal truths are necessary because God's will is itself immutable, eternal, meaning there never was a time when God could have willed them to be different. They flow directly from his unchanging nature.
Oh, interesting. So it's not that God created them and then poof, they became necessary. It's that their necessity is like baked into God's being from the start.
Exactly. Subtle but really important difference. It's not something imposed on them, it's part of God's will itself.
That's a cool way to look at it. It's not creation versus necessity. They're like two sides of the same
Uh,
coin. Eternal truths are necessary because they're based in God, in
huh.
his never-changing being.
Exactly. And this has some, really big implications for how we see the relationship between God, the world, and human knowledge. If eternal truths are necessary because of God's will, then they tell us something really fundamental about how reality works.
It's like we're seeing the blueprint of the universe, and that blueprint is ultimately based in God himself.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're seeing how Descartes' view of possibility, it's not just anything goes. It's connected to his ideas about God, about knowledge, even about reality itself.
Absolutely. And this leads us to another tricky part of his modal metaphysics, the whole question of unactualized possibilities.
Now, this is where things get really weird, right? Because Descartes says we can talk about what's clearly and distinctly possible. But then he also says potential being is nothing.
Yeah, it's like, wait, what? It sounds like a contradiction. If something's possible, doesn't that mean it's got to have some kind of being, even if it doesn't actually exist out there in the world?
So how do we untangle that? Where do all these unactualized possibilities fit in this Descartes system that's all about substance and actual things?
It's a huge question. And it leads us down this philosophical rabbit hole. On one hand, Descartes seems to be saying if something doesn't actually exist, it's nothing, gone, doesn't even, register on the scale of being.
But then how can we talk about all these possibilities, the things that could have been or might be,
Oh.
if they have no being at all? It's like saying we can think about unicorns, but the thought of a unicorn is just empty? It doesn't seem right.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head, the core of the problem. We have to remember, Descartes, he's working within a very specific framework. His whole metaphysics, it's built on this idea of substance, things that exist independently, and their modes, which are ways those substances exist.
Okay, remind me how that works again. So for Descartes, the mind is a substance,
Yeah.
and thinking is one of its modes.
Exactly, spot on. And a physical object, say a tree, that's a substance. And it has modes like height, shape, location. This substance mode way of thinking, it's really important for him because it helps him build this clear and distinct picture of reality. No fuzzy concepts, no things that only kind of sorta exist.
Gotcha. So where do these unactualized possibilities fit into this picture? Are they like some weird ghost substance just floating around waiting to become real? Or are they just modes of something else?
Good questions. Really good. They get right at the heart of the problem. Let's try out some options, even if none of them totally work. One possibility, maybe unactualized possibilities, they're creatures, like a third category alongside minds and bodies. But that seems messy, given how much Descartes loves a nice, tidy system. Where they fit in, what would they be made of, even?
Yeah, it's like jamming a square peg into a round hole. Doesn't feel very Descartes.
Exactly. So if they're not their own kind of creature, maybe they're ideas in God's mind. God conceives of all these possibilities, but only some become, actualized in creation.
Ooh, okay. So God's mind has the blueprint for everything that could be, but he chooses to only bring some of them to life.
That's a popular take, but it runs into trouble. When you think about Descartes saying, God's intellect and will are the same, whatever God understands, he creates. So if these unactualized possibilities are ideas in God's mind, wouldn't that mean they're actual just by definition?
Oh, right. Okay, so they can't be their own creatures, and they can't be ideas in God's mind. Where does that leave us? Is Descartes just contradicting himself?
Not necessarily. One way out of this mess. Rethink how Descartes uses the term possible existence. What if he's not talking about, a separate realm of unrealized possibilities? What if it's more about how all created things depend on God?
So instead of imagining, unactualized possibilities as these things that could exist but don't, we should think of them as highlighting how everything that does exist, it could have been otherwise.
You got it. Creatures exist, yeah. But their existence, it totally depends on God's will. There was never a guarantee they'd be here. In that sense, they're possible because their being is contingent, not because they're hanging out in some, shadow realm of potential.
That makes a lot more sense. It shifts the focus away from unactualized possibilities as these separate things and onto the fact that everything that exists, it's kind of a gift, not a necessity.
Exactly. And this way of thinking, it has implications for how we understand human freedom, which I know you've been wanting to talk about.
Yeah. This whole time I've been wondering, how can human beings be free if God has already determined everything? Does this new way of looking at possibility help us with that at all?
Maybe. Remember, Descartes says God is the ultimate cause of everything, including our actions. But he also insists we have genuine freedom. How does that work?
Right. It does sound kind of like a paradox. If God's pulling the strings, how can we really choose?
One way to think about it is to go back to his idea of clear and distinct perception. Descartes says the will is most free when it's guided by a really clear understanding of the truth, when it acts according to reason.
So true freedom isn't just about doing whatever you feel like. It's about matching your choices with what you really truly understand to be right and good.
Precisely. And this aligning with the truth, that's where God comes back in. For Descartes, remember, reason, that's the divine spark within us. It lets us grasp eternal truths, which are reflections of God's nature.
So the more we work on our reason, the more we're participating in this divine order. Our choices are freer not because they're just random, but because they're based on a deeper understanding of how things really are, an understanding that's ultimately rooted in God.
Beautifully put. Human freedom, then, it's not about rebelling against God's will. It's about aligning with it by using our reason, choosing wisely, not just choosing randomly.
But wouldn't that mean we'd never make mistakes? If we're supposed to be guided by reason, why do we mess up so much? Why do our passions and desires often lead us astray?
That's where Descartes' analysis of error and the will comes in. He says error comes from misusing our free will, from letting our passions cloud our judgment.
So we have the ability for clear perception, but we don't always use it well.
Right. Descartes thinks the will tends to just go along with whatever the intellect gives it, even if that info is wrong. It's like we can know something's wrong, but the desire for pleasure or fear of pain, it can override that knowledge, and we end up making bad choices.
It's not just about having the right info then. It's about having the willpower to actually act on it, even when it's tough, even when it goes against what you want in the moment.
Exactly. And for Descartes, this is where moral effort comes in, this constant struggle to align our will with the truth, to cultivate virtue and resist those baser instincts.
This is a pretty demanding view of freedom. It's not just about having options. It's about having a trained mind, disciplined will, and a deep understanding of what's truly good and right.
It is demanding, but for Descartes, that's what makes us different from animals. We have this ability to go beyond our immediate desires, to act according to reason, which is that divine spark within us.
But hold on, if we're constantly battling error, doesn't that mean our freedom is limited anyway? It sounds like we're fighting this deterministic force almost.
You're right to point that out. It brings us back to one of the big tensions in Descartes. How to square human freedom with God's omnipotence, his foreknowledge.
Right? If God knows everything that will happen, doesn't that mean our choices are already set? Where's the room for real freedom in a universe run by a God who sees all, knows all?
It's the question, isn't it? Haunted philosophers for centuries. And Descartes is no different. He knows it's hard to make those two ideas fit. His attempts, they often rely on, well, subtle distinctions and saying God's ways are mysterious.
So maybe we can't fully grasp how human freedom and divine preordination, how they coexist, but we can appreciate how Descartes struggling with this. It gets us thinking about choice, responsibility, and the limits of our own knowledge,
For sure. And even if Descartes doesn't give us a perfect answer, he gives us this framework for thinking about freedom that emphasizes reason, moral effort, and aligning ourselves with, well, a divine order.
Yeah. This has been a really rich discussion, but before we get totally lost in the weeds of Cartesian metaphysics, I want to shift gears a little bit. We've been talking about freedom in the abstract, but I'm curious how Descartes' ideas play out in a more concrete way. Like, how does this vision of freedom connect to his views on, the mind-body problem?
Oh, that's a great transition. Remember, Descartes says mind, body, two different substances. Body is material, takes up space, follows the laws of physics. The mind, though, it's immaterial, it thinks, and crucially, it's free.
So our bodies might be stuck following deterministic rules, but our minds have some independence because they're operating on a different level.
Exactly. And this separation of mind and body, it changes how we think about possibility itself.
Okay, now I'm really interested. Tell me more about how the mind-body problem connects to Descartes' ideas about possibility.
Well, think it like this. If our minds really are separate from our bodies, it opens up all these possibilities of imagining them apart. Descartes actually does this in the Meditations, right? He pictures his mind existing even without a body.
Oh yeah, the I think, therefore I am thing. He's basically saying, even if everything else is fake, the fact he's doubting thinking, that means his mind is real. even if his body isn't.
Right. And because he can imagine the mind existing without a body, that suggests for Descartes it's not just some abstract idea, it's a genuine possibility.
Okay, I'm following so far. But how does that connect to possibility, like in general? Are we saying that anything, if we can imagine it clearly, then it must be possible?
Ah, good question. That gets at how Descartes sees the relationship between our minds and the world. He's not saying that any random thought automatically means something's possible. He's still all about that clear and distinct perception, remember?
Right, so it's not just imagination gone wild, it's more like a specific kind of intellectual grasp
Yeah.
of concept, a scenario, whatever.
Exactly. And for Descartes, this clear and distinct perception, it's ultimately grounded in God. He says God wouldn't deceive us. So if we really clearly and distinctly perceive something, then it must be possible, at least in principle.
So it's like God guarantees our clear perceptions. If we're using our reason the right way and we get to this clear understanding, we can trust that it reflects a real possibility, even if we can't quite picture how it would work out in the world.
Precisely. Which brings us back to, that tension between freedom and God knowing everything. Even if God knows what will happen, even if our choices are already set in some way, the fact that we can clearly conceive of different possibilities, it suggests our minds have some independence.
So the end result might be fixed, but the whole process of thinking it through, weighing different choices, that still has meaning.
That's one way to look at it, through Descartes' lens. It's tricky, it's complex, like we've been saying, there's no easy answer. But looking at his modal metaphysics, his mind-body stuff, and how he sees freedom, we can start to see how deep and sophisticated his thinking really is.
What's striking me is how Descartes weaves together all these different ideas into this, well, coherent but challenging system. It's not just about possibility or freedom by themselves. It's about how they connect to God, knowledge, even the structure of reality itself.
Definitely. And even if we don't buy everything he says, engaging with Descartes makes us ask those big questions about ourselves, the universe.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be a thinking being in a world where God knows all? What can we really do? How free are we? Those questions are still relevant, even today.
So wrapping up our deep dive into Descartes, his modal metaphysics, what are some key takeaways? What's the so what of all this intense philosophical stuff?
Well, I think the big one is Descartes makes us rethink what we mean by possibility and necessity. He pushes us to go beyond just our gut feelings and look at the underlying principles that make these concepts work.
He also shows how important clear and distinct perception is for doing metaphysics, right? It's not enough to just have beliefs. We got to examine them, see what they're based on, what they really mean.
Exactly. And for Descartes, this whole search for clarity, it's not just an intellectual thing. It's almost spiritual.
Yeah.
It's about getting in sync with the divine order, with those eternal truths that reflect God's own being.
So even if Descartes doesn't give us all the answers, he gives us the tools to start our own journeys, intellectual ones, spiritual ones. He reminds us that philosophy is not just about abstract ideas, it's about living a more thoughtful life, a more examined life, a more meaningful life.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. It's been tough, but really rewarding, and I hope it's left you with new insights and a desire to learn even more about this fascinating world of Descartes' thought.
Absolutely. And for all of you listening, we want to hear from you. What stuck with you? What questions are still bugging you? Join the conversation. Keep the philosophical discussion going. Until next time, keep those minds sharp, those questions coming. And remember, as Descartes might say, cogito ergo sum.